So, Genesis 1 and 2, world prior to sin, 3 to 12, background of redemption, 12 to 50, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Then we talked, you and I got to talking, we looked at Exodus 1 to 12, slavery in and judgment upon Egypt. So think about where you are and how this ties directly in very nicely into Genesis. And it ties nicely because God's the one that did it, right? That's why it ties nicely. But what's the context? You've got Abraham's family is now down in Egypt because of the famine that had come about, and that Joseph, because of his being sold into slavery and the providence of God keeping him alive, that now Joseph is down in a leadership position. Basically, he's second only to Pharaoh in Egypt, and through that situation and the famine, Abraham's family is now brought down into Egypt for preservation and growth. And now Exodus 1 and 12, slavery and judgment upon Egypt. Now Exodus 1:7. What do we notice about Exodus 1:7? Right? The children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied, waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. What is that? What is that telling me? Emphatically, repetitively, Israel's growing, which points me back to the nation promise. It's pointing me back to saying God is keeping His promise. God is keeping His promise. The promise that He made to Abraham, that threefold promise, land, nation, and seed, all three of those are going to come true in time. And here you see one of them coming to fruition. And then Exodus 9:16, well actually before we get there, let's look at Exodus 3:8. In Exodus 3:8, it's where God, speaking from the burning bush, speaking to Moses, what's He say? I've come down to deliver thee out of the hand of the Egyptians, unto a good land and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, and unto the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So you think, what's that emphasizing? Land. So nation promise, land promise. Well, what's the third one that goes with it? The seed promise. What's God doing in this section? Exodus 9:16, and in very deed for this cause have I raised thee up, for to show in thee my power. I think I just kind of realized something I don't know that I've ever realized before. Exactly in that way. In very deed for this cause have I raised thee up, for to show in thee my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. You know, the picture, the third part of the promise may in fact be present in that section in picture form. In other words, the crushing of Pharaoh, the release of Israel, is in fact very much like the crushing of the head of the serpent. The release of man from sin. You know, bondage. They were in bondage, and that's what sin is. It's a slave master. It's a taskmaster. And so there's your three parts of the promise very well, in fact, perhaps. But nonetheless, it is true that they were in bondage and they were freed from bondage. And so we looked at that last time. Remember Exodus 4:23. What is God telling Moses there to say to Pharaoh in Exodus 4:23? This is still review, so let's, the quicker I get through the review part, then we get into new stuff. What's God saying there in Exodus 4:23? And if not, He says, let my son go, and if thou refuse to let my son go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn. Okay? So then that was the first plague, right? Wrong. Death of the firstborn is the last plague, not the first plague. So there were 9 plagues that preceded that. What do you think that says? Why are there 9 plagues preceding? I'm not asking why is it the number 9. I'm asking, why are there quite a few plagues that precede what God said He was going to do?
Because God is long-suffering. He was giving him the opportunity to change, and He never did.
And He never changed. That's right. He's giving them the opportunity to change. What about when Jesus came to this world and worked in His ministry? He was born after a miraculous conception, then He's born into this world, fulfilling prophecies. You think about Jesus, right? Think about how the book of Matthew is laid out. And you open up the book of Matthew, in Matthew 1:1-17, Jesus is the seed of Abraham. Matthew 1:18-25, Jesus is the seed of woman. And there's a quotation there of Isaiah 7:14, because Isaiah 7:14 is a prophecy of Christ coming in, being born of a virgin, which connects all the way back to Genesis 3:15. And so, but then in Matthew 2, you have two basic responses to Jesus' birth. And what are those two basic responses? You got Herod and you got the wise men, right? Well, Herod tried to kill Jesus, right? And in fact, he murdered lots of toddlers and babies, 2 years and under, right? Trying to get Jesus, but he didn't get Jesus, obviously. But the wise men, they came to worship Jesus. But you know what's interesting? I guess I never realized this until recently, or some points about what I'm about to say. It's interesting how, what did Herod do whenever he realized what did he ask about Jesus in Matthew 2? What did he ask the scribes and the priests? What does he want to know? Where's he going to be born? All right, so isn't it interesting that he asks that question? Because how does someone know where Jesus is going to be born? It's written in the Old Testament prophets. How does someone know to ask the question, where is he going to be born?
Because he's been told the story of it at minimum. He hasn't read it himself.
He knows that it's written somewhere. But think about that. He's asking for he's asking for a fact. He's saying, where's he going to be born? Well, where's that derived? From the Old Testament Scriptures. So he's asking for, I know this is going to be true, and you can tell me the answer by looking at the Old Law, by looking at the Old Testament Scriptures, rather, at the prophets. You can tell me the answer when you look there. But then where did the wise men go first? These wise men are from the east, so I don't know exactly where they're from. I just know they're from the east. Right? I don't know exactly who they are, and I don't know exactly where they're from. I just know they're from the east. But I know this. Where did they go? Expecting to find Jesus. Because remember, they saw his star, and they came to worship him. Where did they go? They didn't go to Bethlehem first. Yeah, they went to Jerusalem. What does that mean about what they knew about? So think about that. Herod knew more about Jesus' birth, the location of his birth, than the wise men. But the wise men were coming to worship Jesus. Herod just wanted to destroy Jesus. So all of this is coming to, this is very much like Pharaoh, is the reason I'm talking about this. Same attitude, same mindset. And it's the same. It doesn't matter what nation you're talking about. It doesn't matter what person you're talking about. If the attitude is such like you find with Pharaoh and many of the Egyptians, and like you found with Herod whenever Jesus was born, that attitude and mindset is a hard-hearted, resistant mindset that doesn't want to hear the truth of God and doesn't care what it says because it's too interested and consumed with other concerns. And so all the way back, you've got these promises being made. Now, God is... I went there whenever I started asking the question about Exodus 4:23, and that this is God's long-suffering working on Pharaoh's behalf. So you think about that. In the book of Matthew, at the beginning, you have all these things pointing to who Jesus is, including that Herod asks the question, where is he supposed to be born? All right, when Jesus rides into Jerusalem, as it's getting really close to his death, is there a passage that goes along with that? There is. So the Scriptures, the prophets, They pointed out, this is going to be Jesus when he's this one born in Bethlehem. He's going to be Jesus. He's the King. He's the Son of God. This one that rides into Jerusalem. So take a look in Matthew 21. I just want you to think about how this kind of bookends the life of Jesus in the book of Matthew and how that connects to sort of what we're talking about in Genesis and Exodus. So in Matthew 21, his triumphal entry, when they drew nigh unto Jerusalem and were come to Bethphage unto the Mount of Olives, then sent Jesus 2 disciples, saying unto them, Go into the village over against you, and straightway you shall find an ass tied and a colt with her. Loose them and bring them unto me, and if any man say aught unto you, ye shall say, The Lord hath need of them, and straightway he will send them. And all this was done that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, Tell ye the daughter of Sion, Behold, thy king cometh unto thee meek, and sitting upon an ass, and a colt the foal of an ass. All right, so who's the identity of this person riding in like this according to that prophecy? It says he's the king, right? He's Christ. He's the king. Did they receive him? Did most people receive him? Let me rephrase. Did everyone receive him like a king? No. Some did, but not everyone. When he was born, and he's fulfilling multiple prophecies in his birth. Were they ready? Were they listening and wanting to hear that and wanting to understand that? No, Herod is using the prophetic nature of the Scriptures to then carry out, trying to use it to his advantage to kill Jesus. To find him and kill him and get rid of the threat that he is that Herod perceives him as to his own power. And no doubt when God said to Pharaoh, Let my son go, Pharaoh thinks, I am in control. I am God. Pharaoh thought he was God. I don't listen to people telling me what to do. So, anyway, just really interesting to me how that works in Matthew there, and it's similar to what we have in Exodus and connects there too because of God is beginning to lay out the promises in Genesis and then Exodus and then lays more of them out, and then they all start coming to fruition, with Jesus' birth and ministry that follows. So, Exodus 4:23 says, Let my son go, and if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn. So God gave him chances. He gave him chances just like Jesus gave the Jews when he was on this earth. And just like, no doubt, as he works with us in our lives today, I can't stand here and tell you how many chances he's going to give you or me, or how long he'll be long-suffering exactly. But I know that he has been very long-suffering with me in my life. And so, to me, it's so beautiful when we get to see who God is and what is he like, when we understand these things that the Bible shows us. So Exodus 5:2, Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, Let my son go. And Pharaoh says, Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. And we talked about that. We talked about Exodus 8:18 and 19, where you had I'm thinking of 9/11. 9/11 is the boils. The magicians couldn't stand before Moses because of the boils. And then 8:18 and 19 is the lice. So you got the magicians did so with their enchantments to bring forth lice. I always crack up when I read that. But they could not, so there were lice upon man and upon beast. I just think it's funny that they're still trying to do stuff that's contrary to what helps them. Like, why are you bringing forth more life? Anyway, but that's why they were doing it, because they couldn't resist the plague. They couldn't combat the plague. They couldn't undo the plague, right? So they're trying to look like that they have power to produce the plague as well. And so, boils, Exodus 9:11. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boil was upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. And then we talked about the plague of hail. And what was the difference? There's a very significant difference in verses 20, in chapter 9, 20 and 21, in how people responded and what their responses were to the plague of hail. What were the responses, in essence? Exodus 9, 20 and 21. What's it say? Remember verse 18, he said, Behold, tomorrow about this time I will cause it to rain a very grievous hail, such as hath not been in Egypt from the foundation thereof, or since the foundation thereof, even until now. Send therefore now and gather thy cattle and all that thou hast in the field. Because everything that's in the field, what's going to happen? And it's not brought home, it's going to die. Then verse 20 says, He that what? He that feared the word of the Lord made his servants and his cattle flee into the houses. But he that regarded not the word of the Lord left his servants and his cattle in the field. Notice one says feared the word of the Lord, one says did not regard the word of the Lord. So fearing means regarding. Not regarding means not fearing. Right? When you fear God, when you have regard for God, you obey. You act upon the word. Versus when you don't have fear for God or you don't regard His word. And by the way, notice the connection. You can't fear God and not fear His word. And you can't have regard for God and not have regard for His word. People say that all the time. They say, oh, I love God and I have regard for God. I'm not going to do what you just said for me to do, or that the Bible says for me to do. Yes, Russ?
What's interesting is, remember, God only hardened Pharaoh's heart. He didn't harden the people. So the fact that they didn't regard His word is all of them. I mean, you're talking about this is plague number 7 in these tough, wise, and one-eyed people.
Yeah, and you think about Pharaoh's hardening of his heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. God hardened his heart. The magicians had a part in it. Moses had a part in it. The idea, when we think of that hardening of his heart, remember what it's not. Okay? False teachers like to use the idea of hardening Pharaoh's heart, and they like to present it as if it's the idea that God reaches into Pharaoh's, soul, and intervening and just makes him against Pharaoh's will, makes him choose not to obey God. And that is not at all what happened. Pharaoh hardened his heart. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then I'm going to also say this. Sometimes brethren want to get so far away from the idea of God hardening Pharaoh's heart that they basically almost want to say that God didn't harden Pharaoh's heart. Well, let me tell you what. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Period. But guess what? Pharaoh had a part in that. Moses had a part in that. The magicians had a part in that. All that simply means is this man said, I don't care what you say, I'm not doing it. And just like a parent can harden the heart of a child, it's the same thing. A parent can tell a child something they don't want to hear, or a boss can tell an employee something they don't want to hear, and as long as that one who's receiving the instruction says, I don't care what you say, I'm not doing it. That's hardening the heart. And the person giving the instruction is hardening the heart, is participating in the hardening of that receiver's heart, not because they're reaching in and forcing them to do it, but because they are telling them something they don't want to hear. So we got to get that. I don't know. People would talk about that. I've heard it a lot of times before. People would talk about it like it's this mystical. God was making Pharaoh do this thing, and Pharaoh was just, a victim of God's coercion, I guess, and that's not at all what hardening Pharaoh's heart means. But yes, and you think about one of the things that is to me so revealing about Exodus 18 and 19 when it talks about the lice. What did the magicians say after they tried and they couldn't? They admitted this is the finger of God. Well, what does that mean? Are they talking about that there's a finger lying on the ground? And that's God's finger? No. What do they mean? This is God's power. God was active in this thing, and we can't do it. If you're Pharaoh, what should that tell you? I mean, let's just make it super simple. If you're an employer and you've got these people that are subject matter experts in this thing that they do, and they come to you and say, we can't do this, this is so-and-so's power, is that something you're going to consider? Yes, you are. But Pharaoh doesn't. He doesn't care. He's like, I don't care. He hardened his heart. Because Pharaoh, there's nothing that will turn Pharaoh around, because Pharaoh is in love with his power. You think about the thoughts. What about whenever, you remember whenever Jesus, in that same chapter we referenced a moment ago, Matthew 21, when he rides into Jerusalem? Remember whenever he cleansed the temple, and then later he's confronted by the Jewish leaders, and they say, by what power, by what authority doest thou these things? And who gave thee this authority? What does Jesus say? Essentially, but he says, I also will ask you one thing, which if you tell me, I likewise will tell you by what power I do these things, or by what authority I do these things. And then what he says to them is, the baptism of John, whence was it? From heaven or of men? All right, a couple things you and I need to remember. Whence was it? That means from where did it originate? And what does Jesus offer as the options for where it originated? Heaven or men. There are only two places it could have come from. That's essentially saying God or not God. God or man. Heaven or earth. All those are synonymous ways of saying that same picture. And notice that the Pharisees don't argue with the fact that it has to be one or the other, do they? They then, what do they start saying amongst themselves? They reason among themselves, saying, if we shall say of heaven, then he will say unto us, why did you not then believe him? Well, think about what that meant. If the Pharisees are present at a point where John is baptizing people, and what does John say to them? John the Baptizer, what's he say to them? Matthew 3. O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bring forth therefore fruits meet for repentance, and think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father. For I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham. And now also the axe is laid under the root of the trees. They were not there to listen and follow John. In fact, if they did listen to and follow John, where would they have gone? Where would John have pointed them? To Jesus, without a doubt. That's what his role was. That was his job. That's the one. I mean, sometimes you're at work and people have different roles at work, especially when you got an office full of big people or a project going on. And sometimes people, this is your one job. This is the thing you do. We need you to do this. Well, that's what John the Baptizer did. He pointed to Jesus. But they didn't listen to him. And that's the power in that question when Jesus asked them, the baptism of John, whence was it? From heaven or of men? And they reasoned with themselves, if we shall say from heaven, then he will say unto us, why did you not then believe him? But if we shall say of men, we fear the people, for all hold John as a prophet. These guys are flat dishonest. They say what they say based on what it will win them in the moment, and what difficulty it will give them in the moment, or what perceived good thing it will give them in the moment. They are flat dishonest. They are liars. They are cheats. They are scam artists. They are murderers eventually. These people do not care. They hate you, whoever they're talking to. That's the significance in that question. From whence was it? From heaven or of men? And so you think about that, and so then they said, well, we cannot tell. Well, we cannot tell. So you've got the magicians telling Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. He didn't care, he didn't listen. Then they couldn't even stand before God whenever they're covered with the boils. Exodus 9:11. Then the plague of hail. And you had some of Pharaoh's servants that followed and listened and feared God and regarded the word of God and listened and brought their animals and their servants in. But then in chapter 10, verse 3, what said? Exodus 10:3. Moses and Aaron came unto Pharaoh and said unto him, thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, how long? What do they ask?
Will you refuse to humble yourself before me?
That's the problem. He lacked humility. Anybody who lacks humility is going to harden their heart. That's what pride is. It's a hardening of your heart. It's basically saying, don't tell me what to do, I know. Don't tell me how to do it, I already know. Anybody ever act like that when you were a kid, to some degree or another? I'm not saying you didn't have a repercussion for it, but I'm saying, did you ever act like it? Yeah, I know I did. Exodus 10:7. Now who's talking to Pharaoh? So think about it. You had Moses and Aaron coming to Pharaoh and saying, how long till you humble yourself? Now in chapter 10, verse 7, who comes to Pharaoh and what are they saying? It's significant to notice who the speakers are, not only for hermeneutics value, but from just understanding what Pharaoh is encountering here. Who's talking in Exodus 10:7? His servants. The servants of Pharaoh came unto him and said, how long shall this man be a snare unto us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. And then notice what they ask. And this is a very bold question for a situation like this. For the relationship between them and Pharaoh. Knowest thou not yet that Egypt is destroyed? Those are the words of servants to a blind, tyrannical, trying to think of a good word to use there that isn't. Yeah, egomaniac, thank you. That was much cleaner than, the word I was going to use wasn't bad, it just wasn't as clean, I guess. No, I shouldn't say clean. It wasn't dirty. This wasn't as clear cut.
A different word.
Yeah, it was just a different word. Thank you. Good job, Russ. And so here you have his servants coming to him and saying this now. And then in chapter 12, what happens? Exodus 12. And this has connection to the establishment of the Lord's Supper, which is incredibly significant. The Passover. It's the 10th plague. It's the plague where God said, you let my son go or I'm going to kill your firstborn. The long suffering that he's been experiencing is about to come to an end. He's at the end. He's about to run into the dead end. It's much like in Genesis 15:16, whenever God told Abraham, but in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. But yet whenever Israel comes to the border of Canaan, and they're supposed to go take the land, Numbers 11-14, but they refuse because of their unbelief. That was saying to us, that tells us, reveals to us that guess what? The Canaanite time was up. God's long suffering was over. This is much like whenever the flood came. The door is closed on the ark. The rain is coming, and it's all the earth is just breaking apart. This is much like the idea that the day the Lord comes again. It's over. There is no choice at that point. You're done. There's no choice. There's no escape. There's no changing anything. It's done. He's got this last opportunity to save his son. Let the people go, Pharaoh. Of course he doesn't. So God says, look at chapter 12, verses 12 and 13. He says, I will pass through the land of Egypt this night. I will pass through the land of Egypt this night. You know, that gave you the timing. That gave you what you've got to do to get ready. When he says there, when I see the blood upon your houses, verse 12, I will pass through the land of Egypt this night and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. God is showing himself to be the one true God. Exodus 12:12 says so. Verse 13, and the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where ye are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. So the message came, hey, you need to do this thing, let my people go. That's Exodus 4:23, Exodus 5:1 and 2. That's the message being delivered, and Pharaoh having a chance to say what he's going to do about it. So the clock started ticking, if you will, and Exodus 12 is, your clock is up. I'm passing through the land tonight, and I'm going to smite all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. And when I see the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, that the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you, when I smite the land of Egypt. And then sure enough, whenever Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, that was during what? None other than the Passover. Feast of Unleavened Bread goes right along with it. Jesus is the Passover for us. He's the Passover lamb. 1 Corinthians 5:7. I mean, he is the Passover. Sacrificed for us, for he is our Passover, sacrificed for us. Well, just like they had to be in the house where the blood is, you and I have to be in the house where the blood is. The house of God, 1 Timothy 3:15, which is the church. That institution which was purchased by the blood of Christ, Acts 20:28. Same institution that Jesus came to establish, came to build, that was established in Acts chapter 2 in Jerusalem. Just like being promised that God, and you know, that's the beautiful thing about the Old Testament pointing toward the coming of the King, Christ, and the coming of his kingdom, the church. Those two basically tie all the way back to the seed of woman and seed of Abraham. Seed of woman is a picture of Christ. They're both pictures of Christ, but the fact that, and we're told more details in the New Testament, but the fact that the seed of woman came to crush the head of the serpent. Seed of Abraham came, and that in him all nations will be blessed. And you think about Isaiah 2 and 3, what's it say there? It shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be exalted above the hills and shall be established, and all nations shall flow unto it. Think about that. Where are the nations flowing? Into the house of God. That's what Isaiah 2 is telling me. So in other words, Isaiah 2 is reaching back to Genesis 12:3, Genesis 22:18, and saying, in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed, in thee shall all nations of the earth be blessed. And he's saying, here's where the blessing of the nations is going to be. It's going to be in the house of God. So therefore, The seed of Abraham has particular connection to the fact that he was coming to establish the church, the house, the family. The seed of woman has particular reference tying to Jesus himself. They both, again, tie to Jesus himself. The church is his body, right? So they both tie to him. They both tie to him. But Jesus is our Passover. We've got to be in the house where the blood is. And there's only one of those, and that's the church. The church belonging to Christ, the church of Christ. And that's what Jesus came to do, is to build that church and to die for it. He died for the whole world, but he gave the whole world directions that this is what you do, is you obey the gospel, and that's where I save you, is in the church, in the gospel. That's why it's good news. And you can't separate the church from the gospel, by the way, right? Matthew 4:23, the gospel of the kingdom. People like to do that as well. They like to, I want to talk about the gospel, but I don't want to talk about the church or the kingdom. Well, you can't. If you remove the good news from the good news, you no longer have the good news. Now I want you to take, we'll close tonight on this thought here. In Exodus 13 to 18, the next section, it's a 2-month journey to Mount Sinai. And it's a period fraught with unbelief. Right? They basically say, why didn't you kill us in Egypt? Why'd you bring us out here to die? We don't have any water. What are we going to drink? I mean, over and over, they're unbelieving. And they're entitled. They have this entitled behavior. And so there's 4 major instances of their unbelief. But in this section, there's also, there's really sort of an overlap here between 12, 13, and then all the way to 18. But bear with me, though. The 4 major memorials. You've got the Passover. You've got the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You've got the Law of the Firstborn. And you've got the circumcision, how circumcision was tied to those things. Circumcision wasn't instituted here, but it was tied to those things. So, but I want you to take a look at what's the purpose of a memorial? I mean, kind of the obvious question, right? What's the purpose? To remember it. Remember something. Look at Exodus 13, 8 and 9. So he talks about the law of the firstborn, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and in verse 8 he describes what he's doing here, 8 and 9. What's he doing? How he says, who are they going to be talking with in the future? What does this predict and say will happen? Who are they going to be talking with in the future?
Their children.
Their children. And your children always ask questions about what you're doing, right? Anybody who has kids ever been asked, what are you doing? What are you doing? What's going on? What are you doing? All right, verse 8. Thou shalt show thy son in that day, saying, this is done because of that which the Lord did unto me when I came forth out of Egypt. Notice this, it shall be for a sign unto thee upon thine hand, and for a memorial between thine eyes. All right, are they literally supposed to put the Passover feast on their hand? And are they supposed to put it between their eyes? No, not literally, but meaning it's supposed to be a prominent reminder that's supposed to help them. But look at the third description there. That the Lord's law may be in thy mouth, for with a strong hand that the Lord brought thee out of Egypt. All right, what does that mean? Notice that intended result. That the Lord's law may be in thy mouth. Okay, are they chewing on God's law? Have they stuck something in their mouth? No. What does he mean?
That they know it. They know so well that they can teach it.
They are going to be talking about it, teaching it to their kids. And if they're teaching it and talking about it, what do they, Ross said it already, but what have they already done? They've put it here so they can talk about it here. Because you can't talk about it if you haven't put it here. So he's saying that the Lord's law may be in thy mouth. There's a purpose behind this. I want you to teach your children. I want you to know it. I want it to be in your heart. And that's what He's doing as He's preparing them to go into the land of Canaan, is He's preparing them to be faithful to Him as He's going about bringing in the seed of woman, the seed of Abraham, into the world. So that one little piece right there, that's beautiful. Don't you think the Lord's Supper is supposed to be the same thing for us? That the Lord's law may be in thy mouth? Absolutely. What are you doing, Mom? What are you doing, Dad? Why are you taking that, as a child might say it, right? I'm not saying, I don't mean this disrespectfully. Why are you taking that cracker? What are you doing with that cracker? Well, son, or well, little girl, or however you might be referring to your child, this is the Lord's body. It's representative of what He did. It's representative of His body. He came and died for me. What are you doing with that grape juice, Mom? Well, this is representative of Jesus' blood. He died for me. I needed Him to save me, and He did. And here's what He did, and here's how it happened, and here's how God promised it. And it's a really beautiful story and a really beautiful picture. And it goes all the way back to the beginning, and I can tell you more about it. Obviously, you want to be teaching and training your children all along. So I'm not suggesting that it starts at that moment, but the point being, it's there to help you and to emphasize it and to reinforce it and to help it. And so there's 4 memorials He gives in that section. And so we'll talk, Lord willing, more about that next time.